It's my very great pleasure now to introduce you to our first plenary speaker, who is Elizabeth Povinelli. Beth is Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies at Columbia University in New York. She originally did her research, or began to put her toe into the research world, I should say, in Australia's Northern Territory, working on Aboriginal women's political status. And I found an interview on the internet where she described how she was actually provoked by the local people themselves. These were people who were involved in one of Australia's longest running and most contested land claims. And they basically said, well, if she was going to engage with them, she had to either be a lawyer or an anthropologist. And she decided she didn't want to be a lawyer. So she went back to graduate school to study anthropology so that she could go back and help them with the land claim. So I think that, for me, was the first kind of promise. The promise of anthropology is somewhere, hopefully, in this talk. Since then, she's explored many things with these people, including the promise of technology, which I think is going to be partly what she's going to talk about today, and experiments that she carried out with people about how to use phones to record and reinforce local protocols about land use and knowledge acquisition. As an ethnographer, Beth is also committed to engaging different kinds of ways of doing politics that might be ignored or unknown in what we think of as mainstream circles. And this commitment of hers is partly about doing field work, but partly about a very detailed and critical reading of legal, academic, and activist writings. And of course, she's done a huge amount of writing of her own, where she's explored and engaged diverse modes of activism and engaged fundamental ethical and political questions. And her 4 key monographs are Labour's Lot, The Power, History, and Culture of Aboriginal Action. That was in 1994. Then The Cunning of Recognition, Indigenous Alterities and the Making of Australian Multiculturalism in 2002. The Empire of Love, Towards a Theory of Intimacy, Genealogy and Carnality, which was in 2006. And most recently, Economies of Abandonment, Social Belonging and Endurance in Late Liberalism. And that's recently in 2011. These projects comprise what she calls an anthropology of the otherwise. And this, I think, is a project that brings the third promise. It's an interrogation of the promise of social projects. What can these projects deliver? And what possibility they give us for thinking about new forms of political life that may or may not emerge. So I'll say no more, because what I really want to do is hear what Beth has to say. And the title of her talk, which is totally unpronounceable, but it looks great in writing, but I realise it's not so easy to say, is the Geontological Sciences, the geographies and biographies of power. So, welcome.
First, is this the right length? Yeah, good. First, I'd like to thank Manchester and Open University, and Penny and Mark in particular, for inviting me to address y'all this morning. If not to thank them for inviting me to address you at the first plenary, having just got back to New York from Australia on Friday night. So I was saying to Penny that as I was flying over last night, I had a dream that the plane landed in Serbia, and then it turned into a tram. So I'm not really sure what that means, other than I'm hoping that I'll make it through this talk. And I'm especially really quite pleased and honored to be here, because I actually think the thematic is extraordinarily important, and the question of promises in some ways I think has replaced the problematic of the apology, which was something that a number of us were trying to think through maybe even a decade ago. And the idea of a promise is, of course, fundamental to not only the kinds of alternative social projects that have interested me for quite a while now, but also to the very, to speak loosely, ideologies of late liberalism. So it's this area in which both those who imagine some other form of social worlding and those who seek to maintain a certain social world intersect in interesting ways. But that's not what I'm really going to talk about today. So let me just start, so I have plenty of time to end. What happened to that? Oops. Okay, so in 2005, I began a discussion with elder Indigenous friends and colleagues of mine who were still living at the Belleune community, which is a small, about 200 people, indigenous community located on a peninsula right across the harbor from Darwin, the city of Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia. And I began a discussion with them about what I should do with a massive archive I had accumulated over the previous 20 years. Several of these older, still living men and women told me to burn it. If the form of life recorded in the archive were only relevant to an archival imaginary, then from their point of view, this form of life was dead and should be treated as all other remains of dead human life. A hole should be dug, sung over as the remains of this archive were burned in it, and then the hole should be covered and stamped over. For many years, some would know what this now traceless hole contained, but over a longer period of time, others might only have a vague feeling, vague, perhaps melancholic feeling about the site, and even over a longer period of time, it might just become an organic contribution to the general geological conditions of place that defined wherever this hole that I burned my archive in was buried. Or perhaps some of these older women and men quipped, a large resort would be built on top of it and there would be nothing to worry about at all. Now others suggested I work with the Northern Territory Library, which was helping at the time in 2005, which was just beginning to create and help communities create local, what is often called brick and mortar digital archives. That is, a community archive stored on a dedicated computer with software that allowed local communities to organize viewership based on clan age, clan, or ritual appropriate rules to the place. So that then there was software developed by your community to do this. So you could actually program who could do it, who could view various sites based on their local profile and the rules governing that profile. But when I spoke with the children of these men and women, my age mates, about what they would want me to do with my archive. What would you want? If you could have anything, I said, what would you want? Not wanting to really burn it, so trying to find somebody who said something other than burn it. When I spoke to my age mates about what they saw as a promise of this archive, they expressed a desire for something other than a brick and mortar, and it just means that the computer is a thing in a thing. Something else they would like me to do with it. What was that? Could you make a movie? And could I make a specific kind of movie? Could I make a movie of their parents' and grandparents' lives? Now, given the life expectancy of Indigenous men and women, by the time these children and grandchildren that I was talking to, like many children and grandchildren who are not Indigenous, were old enough to care about their own history, their parents were often long dead and gone. So if Indigenous men and women die on average around their mid-50s, by the time kids got old enough to care, their parents and definitely their grandparents were no longer with them. So if I could make movies using their relatives, deceased relatives' own words and stories that they were sure was in this archive, they could play these stories on their DVDs and come to know where they came from, what their stories were, and etc. When I asked about a genre form, like, because of course I'm sensitive, like we all are, to local Indigenous genres, they looked at me and they said, normal, like a movie. I said, okay. So in early 2007, just as this project was getting underway, both I was working with the libraries to get a dedicated computer, and I was learning Final Cut and working with these younger kids, I'm not kids, so my age mates, on learning Final Cut so we could make these little movies. Right at that time, a violent riot broke out on the Belleune community. The cause of the riot was socially complex. In a nutshell, it mixed personal grudges that accumulate over the years with the legacy of a very divisive land claim in which only a small group of younger adults from the entire community was found to fit the legislative definition of a traditional owner. But this smaller group of young adults would not have been able to be recognized under the procedures of a land claim. if it hadn't been for the older community elders, men and women, who were not considered to be traditional owners. Oops, which way is this going? This is always the thing about these things. If they had not been there to support these younger kids with their own much longer history in the landscape. In legal terms, the kids who were recognized as traditional owners fit the first part of this definition, i.e. they were a local descent group, and just in our typical social anthropological concept of a local descent group. But the larger community, and especially the parents of these now age mates that I was working with, fit A there, this second part, which is they had all the stories, all the history that provided these small kids with the common spiritual affiliations to a site on the land that made them the proper local descent group. In 2007, when we were just beginning to engage in this archival project, beset by chainsaws and pickaxes reported in the local papers, 30 people who were not part of this traditional owner group, but whose parents had been the condition for these traditional owners to be recognized, walked away from Belyuen and from the well-paying jobs they had there. These folks, these 30 people who walked away, were the children and grandchildren of the key, then deceased contributors to my archive. Now, the riot was reported in the local press, and the local labor government, keen to demonstrate its commitment to Indigenous well-being, promised these 30 people housing and jobs in their traditional country, located about 300 kilometers south on the coast, which had a small outstation, but with little infrastructure and definitely no jobs. So they all moved down to this little outstation, and they were living in tents. 2 months later, the federal government forced the release, so the Commonwealth government forced the release of a report into the welfare of Indigenous children in the Northern Territory, part of which discussed the sexual abuse of children on remote Indigenous communities. The conservative federal government, who forced the release of this report, facing a difficult national election, fanned a national sex panic and declared on the back of this sex panic a massive intervention in Indigenous life based on what it called the failed policies of cultural recognition and cultural support. From now on, this conservative federal government said, welfare payments to Indigenous people would be forcefully managed. Indigenous lands that had been won under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act would be forcefully acquired and managed. Police would now have a permanent presence on all communities. All children would be subjected to mandatory sexual examinations. Indigenous people would be forced into cities where there was no housing, but supposedly jobs, and outstations would no longer be funded. Overturning decades of state and public discourse, this conservative federal government, backed by specific Indigenous and non-Indigenous intellectuals and anthropologists, such as Noel Pearson, Marcia Langton, and Peter Sutton, declared in the major newspapers, southern newspapers, that Indigenous culture was the problem, not the solution to Indigenous well-being, and if Indigenous well-being was to ever be improved, then Indigenous people had to move out of their primitive cultural attitudes and into a new enterprise, i.e. neoliberal framework. Sitting in tents on lands most of them barely knew, the children and grandchildren who left this community and whose parents and grandparents were key contributors to my archive suddenly heard, well, they heard nothing, but when they asked the local government when their housing was coming, were told that no houses would now be coming, no jobs, and nothing would be done to help them relocate out of this remote community and into one of the most jammed and expensive rental markets in the country, in Australia, that is Darwin. It was in the wake of this massive neoliberal reorganization of the Australian governance of Indigenous life, without any housing or jobs, and in the fragile coastal ecosystem of Northwest Australia on the coast, that my friends and I embarked on a quest to create a transmedia project at the heart of which would be an augmented reality program. This augmented reality project promised to support these my age mates' understanding of place-based responsiveness and responsibility of land and people, and to provide a foundation for my friends' economic and social stability in the wake of the intervention. And the intervention is what this new approach to Indigenous governance came to be called in shorthand. The basic technological principles of this augmented reality project were simple. Media files, visual, audio, pictures, would be geotagged vis-a-vis a GPS signal, such that they could be played on smartphones or tablets in regions without phone networks, and only be able to be played proximate to the site to which they referred, even as in the broader vision of this, the same media could be delinked from this locational signal and moved across other formats and platforms, so that you could take some of this media and combine it into long playing formats for more traditional movie theaters. For the augmented reality project, i.e. for media that would be geotagged and playable only proximate to a site, these files could be downloaded from a website onto one's phone or one's smart tablet, much as one downloads iTunes. So you'd go to a site, you'd see like dots over the landscape, it'd say, there's a story here, you download it into your phone, but because it's geotagged, you'd have to be proximate to the site, a little signal go ding, and then it would tell you the file was available, you'd click on it, and suddenly you would have this video file talking to you as you were looking at the place, so it's superimposed on it. That's what makes it augmented reality. The social vision of, and just to show you how somewhat developed this was from a business perspective, different pricing schemes would allow revenue production, so you could have different pricing schemes. You could have a $1 version, you could have a $10 version of the same thing, would allow revenue production for this group of friends of mine. At the same time that the web-based nature of the historical and cultural information would be attracted to their kids. So they thought this is actually a way of getting our kids totally into trying to understand the landscape. Now, the social vision of the project was also fairly clear. The augmented reality project would allow these men and women to embed their geontological principles and practices in cutting-edge communicative technologies, allowing them access to information economies and engagement with their increasingly tech-savvy kids. And the virtual nature of the medium would have, they thought, a minimal impact on the physical features of the environment. So you preserve the environment, you engage your kids, and you make money. To accomplish these tasks, they incorporated into the Katabing Indigenous Corporation in 2008. Katabing is not a language, a clan, or a territorial designation. It's a state of affairs that the Katabing members signals the very hopes that this project for them represented. In Emiango, which is the language from which Katabing comes, Katabing refers to a point at which the tide has reached its lowest. Tide out, Katabing is like out. There it stays until it makes its way back to shore. Katabing does not have the negative connotations of the English phrase low tide. Low tide, I think for a lot of English speakers, suggests a kind of, well, it's low tide, but don't worry, it's going to come back up. There's nothing low about the tide reaching Katabing from the coastal perspective. All kinds of potentialities spring forward or forth when the tide is at its lowest. In the coastal region, which surrounds the place where everyone was living, a deep Katabing opens shorter passages between mainland and island, so that tide goes way out, and what you have to cross in terms of water gets quite small. In some places, reefs rise out of the water as the water recedes, and you can just walk across them. Different kinds of food groups are available. Now, just to tell you where they are today, there's been we've done various things. There's a website, we've made a movie, But so far, we've failed to find the money to develop the software and test this project. What I want to do today, with that bit of an introduction, is to explore, rather than talk really specifically about this site per se, or this project per se, I want to explore the entanglement of late liberal geontologies that this project exposes, including the geontological imaginary that lies behind the law of recognition and the geological imaginary of the Anthropocene. Through an analysis of this ongoing project to create an augmented reality system, I want to ask how the promise of making a space, this particular kind of communicative space, for an alternative geontological imaginary, meets and confronts the social spacing of what may be collapsing forms of late liberal power and emerging imaginaries of climate change. Now, before tackling what the geontology of my colleagues, these age mates of mine, very old friends of mine, we've known each other for like 25 years now, 29 actually, it might be helpful to say what I mean by this neologism, geontology. By geontology, I mean something fairly specific. I mean not to conjure an ontology that takes into consideration the place in which being resides, but a mode of approaching ontology that understands it as a specific arrangement of zoe, bios, and geos. That is a specific distribution of what has come in critical theory to be called bare life, proper life, and with the geo, perhaps non-life. Of course, these terms, geo or geos, bios, zoe, are hopelessly entangled in a Western vocabulary. And if you were speaking Amiangle, you would not say geos, zoe, and bios. You would say awa, mia, terwin, rock, terms that have no translational overlap onto these other three. But these three terms nevertheless put pressure on the presupposition of contemporary critical theories that focus on the entanglement of life and power, especially those theories that have rotated around the concepts of bios and zoe. And I don't think we have to name names, I think we know who they are. Insofar as these theories that examine the entanglement of life and power are themselves entangled in a carbon-based philosophy in which the organic and the inorganic, life and non-life, the world rich and the world poor, as opposed to the world as a setting for these world rich and world poor, are defined by the opposition of the carbon and the mineral, i.e. entities that are synthesized by biological processes and those that are synthesized by geological processes. Our critical theory itself is embedded in and in many ways limited by and limits our understanding of other geontological arrangements, that is, other ways of thinking about the arrangements of life, proper life, and what's considered not to be life. Indeed, the concepts of the animate and the inanimate, agency and subjectivity, and reproductive modes of being versus the non-reproductive settings of being are at stake in how we think about, for me, the geontological, and thus why I invented this very difficult to pronounce word that my computer always turns into gerontology. In other words, the way in which geos, zoe, and bios have been organized has trapped, I think, a Western critical imaginary and critical theory in general in a carbon cycle that is now threatened by the very geological conditions that this critical theory refused to acknowledge as conditioning it. It should not be surprising then to find a number of critical theorists turning to animism and totemism, or the animist and the totemic approaches to geo, bios, and zoe as holding out the promise of a new relationship, giving us a new relationship between human and earth in the wake of this thing called the Anthropocene. For instance, the art critic Anselm Franke has proposed that animism is the queer of our climatic future. In other words, it is the epithet that must be retuned as an anthem. To be sure, Indigenous Australians are rarely called animists. Indeed, Tim Ingold distinguishes Indigenous Australians from the North American Inuit on the basis of their differing totemic and animistic tendencies. So for Ingold, the Inuit are animist and my friends are totemic. But however one groups and categorizes social worlds based on these concepts of the totemic versus the animist, critics like Anselm Franke and others believe that a radicalized form of either animism or totemism holds out the promise of a different relationship between man and earth that would help us solve, among other things, the problem of climate change and the threat of climate change to the human species itself. Now, if I'm honest, part of what makes our augmented reality project compelling is indeed its uncanny convergence, the uncanny convergence of animism and totemism with all of its primitivist overtones, with the cutting-edge digital communication technology that wants to work through. And yet it's hard to find two more fraught terms in the history of anthropology than animism and totemism. These concepts were born from and operated within a colonial geography in which some humans were said to be unable to order the proper causal relationships between objects and subjects, agencies and passivities, organic and inorganic life, and thus control language and experience through the self-reflexive reason that this kind of ordering of life and non-life gave us. Animism and totemism have very specific visual and sound aesthetics, that you won't hear the sound aesthetics, so suffused with various presuppositions about a timeless irrationality that most scholars have been, I think properly, wary of wading anywhere close to them lest they be sucked into the current of this kind of primitive, this projection of primitive thinking. But the return to animism, which I think we're seeing widely, at least in critical theory, but in some parts of anthropology and cultural studies, is, I think, what makes the intersection of this project, this augmented project, with the geological concept of the Anthropocene so interesting. It is exactly the articulation and segregation of geos, bios, and zoe in critical theory that is placed under intense pressure by the concept of the Anthropocene and animism, totemism. For those of us who have forgotten, the Anthropocene is a geological term coined to note the passing of the Holocene into a new geological age in which human activities are now determining the geological destiny of the planet. Note the term destiny. It's not as if humans never had an effect on the planet. They've always had an effect on the planet, on the geology of the planet. The Anthropocene, from a geological point of view, marks how modern industrial capitalism, with its specific partitioning of subject and object, rationalism and irrationalism, all depending on a very specific ordering of bare life, proper life, and non-life, how modern industrial capitalism has disrupted the normal heating and cooling rhythms of the planet's carbon cycles, such that carbon-based life itself is now under threat. And insofar as it has, this concept of the Anthropocene has put pressure on this organizing, it's vis-a-vis this idea that the planet itself is not just a setting for life, but has a kind of life. Geology, through the Anthropocene, seems to be becoming a little animistic, which is, again, for me, quite interesting. So what I want to do, quickly enough, is start weaving the geontology of the Codabing, through this augmented reality project, into the geontology of what I call late liberalism and this concept of the Anthropocene. But to do so, we have to begin by saying that whatever the geontology of the Codabing is, it's not theirs. And although I'm going to talk about their parents and grandparents, you'll see that it's not their parents and grandparents' geontology in the anthropological, the kind of more classic anthropological sense either. So let's say the geontology that the Cottebring presupposed in their augmented reality project emerged from the attempts of their parents and grandparents to manage the dislocations of settler colonialism and its necropolitics of murder, sexual abuse, addiction, and forced labor, stretching between the 1930s and the 1980s in the Northern Territory of Australia. In other words, the parents and the grandparents of the people who, friends of mine and colleagues of mine who are now working on this project, their parents and grandparents' geontology was not anthropological in the sense of a self-referential, self-contained mode of life. It was an analytics of power about how a formation of geos, zoe, and bios that they believed to exist could refashion the world as it had been made by settler colonialism. Now, this is a, I don't know where the pointer is, I won't use it. Anyways, can you see that? You see that line, la, 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 on that side of the line is water. I realize I probably should have made it blue. This line is land here. This is land, and that's water. And all this is showing you basically the dislocations and depopulation of, in a kind of silly way, of this area down here and located onto the Belleune community up there, over from the 30s to the 1980s. And this period, during this period, the grandparents and parents of the folks I'm working with now put the technique of their geontology to work in the period of both assimilation and self-determination. So what Australians call assimilation and could also be called genocide by people like Wolf, and self-determination, which I understand as a variant of liberal cultural recognition. At stake for this now deceased generation was whether they could refigure the world as a place of mutual obligation between biography and geography, even as they scrambled to survive the profound inhospitalities of the assimilative and genocidal settler colonialism that had ruptured a previous alignment of bio and geography. So from moving up, down, from moving from there to up there, could they deploy their geontology in a way in which they could transform dislocation into location? So what were the bare elements of their geontological analytics? At the heart of their analytics, that they tried to turn dislocation into location, was an interpretation of bio and geographical substance, composition, and obligation. Take, for instance, oh, maybe this won't work. We had a, oops, well, that kind of works, okay. Take for instance, those are people. Can you see those people? Right on, okay. People moving. I always think these things help, but I think they don't. But I'm just going to do it anyways. Okay, let's look at substance. For these older men and women, I've talked about this endlessly actually, various kinds of activities produce various kinds of substance. So that's a substance, that's a substance, and that's a substance. During different kinds of practices, hunting, ritual birthing, and burying. So all of these produce all these substances often, but each activity has its prototypical substance from their perspective. And each activity, hunting, ritual, birthing, and burying, has its own prototypically embodied and rhetorical ways of intensifying the activity and the substance itself. Kind of classic anthropological notions here. Speakers, these men and women, who their kids and I knew fairly well, often used the shorthand when they wanted to talk about how substance and in public. So if you're talking about substance in public and its effect, that I'll talk about, they usually just said sweat and language. Language understood as a kind of substance. What they put under analytic pressure, and I want to say analytic pressure, these older folks, during the period that stretched from the 40s to the 80s, was the effect that all of these substances had on the composition of a biogeography, or biography, or geography. They theorize that various bodily substances sink into, including language, sink into and become the compost out of which other substances grow, are eaten, and then returned. And this includes foods, bodies, various kinds of contours of the landscape. Buried or burned bodies, and thus we come back to my archive, it should be burned if it's dead. Buried or burned bodies re-entered the cycle and re-emerged from specific locations in which this composition was occurring. The interpenetration of bio and geography vis-a-vis substance, vis-a-vis these activities and their prototypical substances, composed the human world as a social geography and the social geography as human world. The more people moved around the same place, i.e. they moved out and into this new place, the more this movement etched into the earth a trace and the beginning and ends of the movement itself. That is, it traced, literally etched the paths, indentations, barriers of stone and earth that created the spaces that could then be said to be this and that, or here and there. Place in people, that is the deictics of dwelling in. Place and persons increasingly responded to each other as of habit, and this habituated landscape became to be where human generations would begin and end. But these movements were always complexly embaggonated or stitched together, and that's the stitching of these people, to an elsewhere that could become a new somewhere, depending on various forms of location and dislocation. In other words, by dwelling in and coming to know a place geographically through the power of various kinds of substances to remake both geography and biography, the two, geo and biography, became internal to each other insofar as each began to presuppose the form of each other. Place and people were not outside of each other, but something that was stretched between them. They became the extant in Lacan's language, an assemblage in Deleuze's language, and for those of us who remember my dear colleague Nancy Munn, they became subject and object vis-a-vis one another. For these men and women, the end of this compositionality of locality